Global warming is the gradual increase in the average temperature of the Earth's atmosphere and oceans, believed to be permanently changing Earth's climate and caused by human activities. Natural layers of greenhouse gases form a layer around Earth. When rays of sun hit the Earth, some are absorbed, but most are reflected back into the atmosphere where greenhouse gases take some of the heat and some go into space. The heat trapped by the greenhouse gases spread throughout Earth, keeping it warm enough for life. Humans are increasing the amount of greenhouse gases by burning fossil fuels and vehicle exhaust. Also, the trees that would absorb some of this pollution are being lost to deforestation as more greenhouse gases are entering the air. As they build up in the atmosphere, sun rays are unable to escape back into space. This causes the temperature of Earth to increase, which is what global warming is. Between 1880 and 2010, the temperature of Earth has risen by 1.4 degrees. On this graph, the red line indicates the atmosphere CO2 level at the equator, while the blue line is at the South Pole. Note that the red line fluctuates due to the changing season. There is a gradual increase yearly for the past 55 years. Now compare that to the time length of 2015 years. You will see that what was a gradual increase turned into an accelerated amount of 400 part per million with just 55 years, while for the previous 1960 years, it was a stable 280 ppm. This is another representation of Earth's surface temperature, right starting in 1880.
The effects on weather from global warming include warmer water in the oceans pumps more energy into tropical storms, making them stronger and potentially more destructive. Even with storms of the same intensity, future hurricanes will cause more damage as higher sea levels exacerbate storm surges, flooding, and erosion. The number of Category 4 and 5 storms has greatly increased over the past 35 years, along with ocean temperature. Warmer temperatures could increase the probability of drought. Greater evaporation, particularly during summer and fall, could exacerbate drought conditions and increase the risk of wildfires. Warmer temperatures increase the energy of climatic system and can lead to heavier rainfall in some areas, putting many communities at risk for devastation from floods.
That video demonstrated what some would consider the failure of the Kyoto Protocol. The countries that were polluting the most demanded that developing nations make the same emission cuts as them. As some countries developed, they didn't want to reduce emissions further, which could hurt their economy, so they continued to put the pressure on the wealthy nations. Also, developed countries were paying developing countries to cut their emissions so they wouldn't have to. This has turned away from what the agreement was created for.
Hello and welcome to the interview here on France 24. Our guest today is János Pastor, who was very recently appointed as the United Nations Assistant Secretary General on Climate Change with the task of shepherding a global deal on climate change in Paris at the end of the year. Mr. Pastor, thank you very much for coming on the France 24 set.
Thank you.
Obviously, those talks are in full swing as we are. The objective is a legally binding and global agreement that would limit carbon emissions to keep global warming below 2 degrees Celsius. This is obviously a very, very ambitious objective. Are we on track to reach it by the end of this year?
We are on track to reach an agreement. What will be the content of the agreement is, of course, going to be worked out during the course of the year. And that agreement has many different components, and it's the totality of the package that will assure us by the end of the year whether or not we're on that track to reach that 2 degree target that you talked about.
But from all the discussions you're having around the world, do you sense that there is a real willingness by the main actors to reach something that would really change the situation?
There is a strong willingness just about everywhere to actually come to an agreement. Countries really want an agreement because we've been working at this for many years. As you know, there have been negotiations for many years, and there is a willingness. Of course, not any agreement. It's important that the content of the agreement, that it be ambitious enough in terms of what countries can bring to the table at this time, that is to say in Paris at the end of this year, but also that the agreement contains sufficient elements to make sure that whatever is brought to the agreement table in Paris can be reviewed and monitored to make sure that over time we continually improve our response to climate change.
How urgent is this agreement? Because we hear some people saying, you know, it's 5 minutes to midnight. If we don't reach an agreement, it's the end of the world as we know it. I mean, how urgent is this? Is this an overstatement, or is really Paris the last chance to really change that equation?
The Secretary General has said that our generation is the last generation that can actually do something about climate change. So it's in that sense, it is urgent. It is not that tomorrow we must finish all the work. No, we have some time, but we don't have a lot of time because climate is already changing. You can see it, you can measure it, you can feel it. Just see what's happening in the Arctic. The ice is thinning. Look at the weather patterns across the world. Look at the increase in hurricanes and extreme weather events. So the climate is changing, and the longer we wait, the more difficult and the more expensive it will be to do something about it. So in that sense, it's urgent because if we don't do it today, yes, tomorrow we can still do it, but it will be more expensive and more difficult.
The UN wants all countries to set goals for cutting greenhouse gas emissions before December's climate conference in Paris. Now, the top 10 emitters in the world have, and here's how they stack up. Let's look at the top 3 emitters of CO2. First up, China. The world's biggest emitter set goals to cap emissions within the next 15 years.
To me, this is an agreement that's terrible for the United States and terrific for the Chinese government.
Despite criticism, it's China's first commitment to cap emissions, and the country has actually invested more money in renewable energy than anyone else, including number 2, the US. In a joint announcement with China, the US set a goal of lowering emissions 26 to 28% below 2005 levels by 2025. The US is the only country in the top 3 with decreasing emissions. And solidly in third place, India. India was the last of the top 10 to announce its goals to produce 40% of its power from renewable or low-carbon sources by 2030. It hasn't committed to a concrete reduction in emissions, wary of hurting its economic growth, the fastest in the world. Next, developed countries in the top 10. Developed countries make up half of the top 10, and after the US, Japan leads the pack with more than 1 billion metric tons emitted in 2013. The country set a goal to reduce emissions 26% from 2013 levels by 2030, but it's become increasingly reliant on coal since the Fukushima nuclear disaster. Germany, South Korea, and Canada round out the group, and the first 2 have set fairly ambitious goals, although Canada has actually lowered its goal on the back of its controversial oil production from tar sands. Now let's take a look at the other half, developing countries. Next to China and India, Russia is the 3rd biggest emitter in the developing world, putting out 1.8 billion metric tons of CO2 in 2013. One of the biggest oil producers in the world, Russia's goal for the summit is kind of non-committal, a 25 to 35% drop from 1990 levels by 2030, with the major caveat that it depends on the outcome of the conference. Indonesia and Brazil, the last 2 developing countries, face one of the same challenges, deforestation. In Brazil for agriculture and in Indonesia for palm oil production. Both countries cite reducing deforestation as a means to their goal, a 37% reduction from 2005 levels by 2025 for Brazil, and a 29% cut from business as usual levels by 2030 for Indonesia. These top 10 emitters contribute 72% of the world's greenhouse gases, which means these countries could easily decide whether negotiations in Paris live or die.
If the Kyoto Protocol was unable to meet its targets of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, how do we know this new agreement will be a success? Southern Europe, North Africa, the Middle East, and the American Midwest will be uninhabitable due to the excessive heat and drought. Also, coastal cities will need to be evacuated, along with roughly 1/10 of the world's population living in low-lying coastal areas, including entire nations being displaced by the rising sea level. This would create a large amount of people that would need to be relocated, termed climate refugees. We would lose many resources that are vital to the world economy, such as agriculture, forestry, fishing, manufacturing, and if entire countries are lost, this disrupts the importing, exporting, and GDPs of all countries around the world, plus the whole amount of the countries lost. Heavy weather events will cause injury, death, days of work missed, as well as damage to infrastructure such as bridges, tunnels, roads, power lines, hospitals, power plants, etc. We will be the primary vector through which climate change will make its presence known. Because a warmer atmosphere can hold more weather, precipitation patterns will change dramatically, with the trend being toward more water coming down at once, leading to increased runoff and flooding, with less water being absorbed into the ground. Other areas will be deprived of rainfall altogether, becoming deserts as a result. In addition to existing farmland falling prey to heat waves and droughts, low-lying coastal regions also face contamination from salt water. All this will place tremendous stress on our ability to feed and steadily growing population. This, in some regions of the world, has already led to social unrest. In order to prevent global warming from happening any longer, we need to invest in renewable energy today and make it the primary source of our energy. This includes wind, solar, hydro, biomass, and geothermal sources. We only have one planet to live on, so let's take care of it.